In the year 60 CE, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power. From the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germania, no force seemed capable of halting the relentless march of Rome's legions. And yet, in a cold, windswept corner of the world that the Romans regarded as little more than a barbarian backwater, an uprising would erupt that nearly erased Rome's presence from Britain entirely. At the heart of this rebellion was a woman, tall, fiery-haired, and consumed by a fury that would make her name echo across history. Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. To the Romans, Britain was supposed to be just another province, a land to be taxed, stripped of its resources, and kept in line with military force. But to the native tribes, Rome's arrival was an insult to their gods, their freedom, and their very way of life. The Iceni, Boudica's people, had initially tried to coexist with the occupiers. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had played the Roman game, swearing loyalty to the emperor, paying tribute, and hoping that his kingdom would be spared the full weight of Roman conquest. But Rome was not known for honoring agreements when there was land and wealth to be gained. When Prasutagus died, he left a will that split his kingdom between his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping this compromise would protect his family. Instead, Rome treated it as an open invitation for plunder. Roman officials descended on Iceni lands like vultures, seizing estates, enslaving nobles, and stripping the tribe of its autonomy. What happened next would ignite a firestorm. Boudica herself was publicly humiliated, whipped and beaten before her people while her daughters were brutally violated by Roman soldiers. This act was not just cruelty, it was calculated humiliation, designed to remind the Iceni that they were nothing more than subjects of Rome. But Rome had miscalculated. They had not broken Boudica. They had unleashed her. Imagine the scene. A woman who had once stood beside her king, now scarred by lashes, her children dishonored, her tribe enslaved. Before her people, she swore vengeance, not merely against the men who had wronged her, but against the entire empire that had sanctioned such atrocities. In a society where warriors worshipped honor and blood, her suffering became a rallying cry. The Iceni rose, but they did not rise alone. Word of Boudica's defiance spread quickly through the tribes of Britain, many of whom had long simmered under Roman taxes, forced conscription, and the desecration of their sacred groves. Allies flocked to her banner, the Trinovantes, the Catuveiani, and countless others. What began as a local rebellion swelled into a tidal wave of fury. Within weeks, Boudica commanded an army numbering in the tens of thousands, a force unlike anything Rome had ever faced in Britain. But Boudica's vengeance was not to be measured in numbers alone. Her fury transformed her into a figure of myth and terror. Ancient accounts describe her as towering, wild-haired, with a gaze that burned like fire. She wore a great golden torque around her neck, a sacred symbol of power among the Celts, and carried a spear in hand as she called upon her people to slaughter the invaders and reclaim their freedom. To her followers, she was more than a queen. She was the living embodiment of their god's wrath. And Rome, complacent in its arrogance, had no idea that a storm was about to fall upon it. In their eyes, Britain was pacified, its tribes too divided and primitive to unite. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was busy campaigning far to the west, attacking the sacred island of Mona, the spiritual heart of Druidic resistance. He believed the province secure enough to allow such a campaign. He could not have been more wrong. Boudica's first target was not a fort or a garrison. It was something far more symbolic: Camulodunum, the Roman colonial capital. Built on the ruins of native sacred sites, it was a living insult to the tribes, a city planted by Rome, inhabited by settlers who sneered at the barbarians around them. Within its walls stood a massive temple to the Emperor Claudius, a towering statement of Roman arrogance funded by heavy taxation on the very people it oppressed. To Boudica, it was the perfect place to begin her war of vengeance. As her warriors gathered, the plan was simple: burn Camulodunum to the ground, slaughter every Roman within its walls, and send a message so clear that the empire would never forget the price of dishonor. The Iceni and their allies advanced with the fury of an avalanche, and for the Romans inside the colony, there would be no escape. The first strike of Boudica's vengeance was about to fall, and when it did, the world would learn that Rome's might was not invincible, and that a wronged queen, fueled by grief and rage, could unleash horrors that would haunt the empire forever. If you're enjoying the video, make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more upcoming history revealing stories like this. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm eager to know that. The people of Camulodunum believed themselves safe behind Roman order. Its streets were straight, its villas decorated with mosaics, and its settlers, mostly retired Roman soldiers, walked with the arrogance of conquerors. They laughed at the barbarians who tilled the fields beyond their walls, never believing for a moment that those same tribes could threaten them. But in the spring of 60 CE, those illusions shattered. At dawn, Boudica's army descended upon Camulodunum with a fury no garrison could contain. The Romans had stationed few troops there, confident that the mere sight of Roman stonework and temples would cow the locals. The defenders scrambled to raise a militia of veterans, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Iceni, the Trinovantes, and their allies poured into the city like a flood, their war cries echoing through the streets, their spears flashing in the early light. The settlers ran for the great temple of Claudius, believing its thick stone walls would shield them. The temple had been built as both a shrine and a fortress, towering over the city as a symbol of Rome's eternal dominance. Now, it became a tomb. The rebels surrounded it, hurling torches and piling wood against its gates. For 2 days, the trapped Romans resisted, praying desperately for legions to arrive. But none came. When the walls finally fell, the slaughter was absolute. Every man, woman, and child inside was cut down without mercy. Camulodunum itself was set aflame. Wooden houses collapsed in waves of fire, their inhabitants screaming as they were dragged into the streets. Ancient accounts speak of tortures too horrific to describe. In detail, Romans nailed to stakes, impaled, or sacrificed to Celtic gods as offerings of vengeance. For Boudica's warriors, this was not random brutality. It was justice. The same justice Rome had meted out when it whipped their queen and violated her daughters. Now the invaders were tasting their own medicine, magnified 100-fold. Imagine standing in that burning city, the sky black with smoke, the ground slick with blood, and in the chaos, a towering woman with wild red hair, golden torque gleaming on her neck, lifting her spear to the heavens as she dedicated the slaughter to her gods. To her people, Boudica was not merely avenging her personal humiliation, she was purging the land itself of Roman corruption. Every Roman body that fell was an offering to freedom. Every burning villa a declaration that Britain would not bow. The destruction of Camulodunum sent shockwaves through the province. Survivors who managed to flee carried tales of horror to neighboring towns. Panic spread. Roman officials realized, too late, that this was no isolated tribal revolt. It was an uprising of nearly the entire east of Britain. And worse, it was led by a queen who commanded not only soldiers but belief. Boudica had become a symbol, and symbols can move armies more powerfully than gold or fear. Rome's response was desperate. A small detachment from the 9th Legion, under Petilius Cerealis, was dispatched to rescue Camulodunum. But by the time they arrived, the city was already ash and corpses. Boudica's forces were waiting for them. The Celts swarmed the Romans, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. The legion's infantry was annihilated, its cavalry fleeing in terror. The 9th Legion, one of the proudest units of Rome's war machine, had been butchered almost to the last man. Only a handful survived to tell the tale. The message was unmistakable. Rome could be defeated, its soldiers could bleed, its legions could die. And once word spread, every tribe that had suffered under Roman taxes, Roman whips, or Roman arrogance now had proof that resistance was possible. With Camulodunum destroyed and the 9th Legion shattered, Boudica turned her gaze further south. Her army had swelled with new recruits, emboldened by victory. Tens of thousands now marched under her command, a human tide bent on obliterating every trace of Rome in Britain. Their next target lay ahead, Londinium. A small city then, but already the beating heart of Roman commerce in the province. Merchants, governors, and settlers had built it into a bustling hub on the banks of the Thames. It was rich, it was vulnerable, and it was Roman. For the people of Londinium, time was running out. The Queen of Vengeance was coming, and with her came fire. Londinium in 60 CE was not yet the mighty London of later centuries, but even then it was a thriving jewel of the province. Built by merchants on the banks of the Thames, it had become the center of trade in Roman Britain. Ships from Gaul and Spain docked daily, unloading wine, oil, and luxuries that only the wealthy could afford. The city pulsed with Roman ambition, its markets bustling, its streets crowded, its officials already dreaming of turning it into a permanent symbol of imperial power. But beneath the surface, it was still vulnerable. Its walls were incomplete, its garrison small, and most of its population civilians. It was a rich prize, perfect for Boudica's vengeance. When news reached Londinium that Boudica's forces had annihilated Camulodunum and destroyed the 9th Legion, panic spread like wildfire. Merchants stuffed their goods onto ships and tried to flee downriver. Families abandoned homes, clutching whatever they could carry. Some begged the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, to defend the city. Surely Rome would not allow its most important colony to be abandoned? But Suetonius was a soldier, not a sentimental man. He knew his legions were outnumbered, his cavalry scattered, and his supplies thin. To defend Londinium against Boudica's swelling horde would mean disaster. So he made a cold, pragmatic decision. He abandoned the city. The legions pulled back to regroup, leaving Londinium citizens to their fate. It was a decision that would haunt Rome's reputation for decades. Boudica arrived within days. Ancient accounts describe her army as a living sea of fury, perhaps over 100,000 strong. Warriors painted with blue woad, brandishing spears and swords, surged toward the undefended city. For the inhabitants who remained, there would be no mercy. The Iceni and their allies poured into Londinium, cutting down anyone too slow to flee. Streets once filled with trade turned into rivers of blood. Temples, markets, and villas alike were torched until the entire settlement was engulfed in flame. Roman chroniclers claimed that not a single inhabitant was spared. Women were subjected to the same brutalities Boudica and her daughters had endured, while men were executed in public rituals meant to terrify future occupiers. To the rebels, this was not senseless cruelty, it was justice written in fire. Imagine walking through Londinium that day. The heat of burning timbers scorching the air, the screams of Romans rising over the clash of Celtic war cries, the golden torque of Boudica gleaming as she raised her spear high, her voice cutting through the chaos. She was no longer merely a queen. She was vengeance incarnate, the fury of Britain itself unleashed upon the empire. But the destruction of Londinium was only the beginning. With every city that burned, Boudica's legend grew, and so did her army. More tribes flocked to her cause, seeing in her not just a leader but a savior who could drive Rome into the sea. The rebellion spread like a plague. Next on her path was Verulamium, modern St. Albans, another Roman settlement built on native land. Its fate was identical. The city was razed, its people slaughtered, its temples desecrated. By the time the fires died down, 3 of Rome's proudest colonies lay in ashes. Roman historians estimated that as many as 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and their allies were killed in these massacres. It was one of the bloodiest uprisings Rome had ever faced. To put that number in perspective, it rivaled the casualties of major wars, yet this devastation had been inflicted not by an empire, but by tribes once dismissed as barbarian savages. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Rome, the eternal empire, the power that claimed it brought order and civilization, was being humiliated on the fringes of its dominion. The smoke of its burning cities rose into the sky like a black warning, visible for miles across the countryside. And yet, even as Boudica's power reached its zenith, the seeds of Rome's counterstrike were being planted. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, though criticized for abandoning Londinium, had not fled in fear. He was regrouping. He knew that Rome's discipline, if properly wielded, could withstand even overwhelming numbers. As Boudica pressed her campaign of fire and blood, Suetonius gathered the remnants of the Roman legions, battle-hardened veterans who understood that defeat meant not just their deaths, but the end of Roman Britain. The stage was being set for a confrontation unlike any Britain had ever seen. Boudica's fury had reduced cities to ash and legions to corpses. But now, she would face Rome at its most dangerous, cornered, desperate, and determined to survive. The question that loomed was simple yet terrifying. Could vengeance and sheer numbers triumph over the cold steel of Roman discipline? The answer would decide not just the fate of Britain, but whether Boudica would be remembered as the liberator of her people or as a queen consumed by the very fire she had unleashed. By the time Verulamium lay in ruins, Britain was unrecognizable. Entire swathes of the province that had once marched to the Roman drum now beat to the rhythm of Celtic war chants. Boudica's army was swollen with recruits from across the island. Tribes who had once been rivals now stood shoulder to shoulder under her banner. She was no longer merely the queen of the Iceni. She had become the commander of a confederation, a living embodiment of vengeance. Wherever she went, the land trembled. But while the tribes were drunk on victory, Rome was not yet broken. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, the man responsible for Britain, had withdrawn his forces not out of cowardice, but calculation. He knew that attempting to defend every settlement would scatter his legions and doom them piecemeal. Instead, he chose the cold logic of sacrifice, better to lose Londinium and Verulamium than to lose the province itself. Every step back was part of his design. As Boudica's army rampaged unchecked, Suetonius regrouped. He recalled scattered detachments, summoned reinforcements from across the province, and gathered his remaining strength. The legions he commanded were veterans, hard men forged in campaigns across Gaul and Africa, disciplined to fight not as individuals but as a single, unyielding machine. He knew he was outnumbered, perhaps 5-1, but Roman history had been written by such odds before. For Rome, order and discipline were sharper weapons than numbers could ever be. Still, the situation was dire. Reports from scouts painted an almost apocalyptic picture. Boudica's host had grown to more than 200,000 warriors, a tide of men, women, and even children who followed her from village to village. Entire tribes had abandoned their farms, taking up arms for the cause of vengeance. This was no longer a rebellion. It was a war of annihilation. Yet numbers can be as dangerous to the wielder as to the enemy. Boudica's vast host, though terrifying, was undisciplined. Supplies became scarce, movement slow, and coordination increasingly difficult. What looked like overwhelming strength also carried hidden weaknesses. Suetonius knew this. All he had to do was survive long enough to force a decisive battle on ground of his choosing. As the two sides prepared, ancient chroniclers preserved vivid descriptions of Boudica herself in these days. She was said to ride in a chariot, her tall frame towering above the crowd, her hair a torrent of fiery red cascading to her waist. Around her neck gleamed a heavy golden torque, the sacred symbol of Celtic nobility, and in her hand she carried a spear. Her voice, when she addressed her warriors, was not soft or pleading but thunderous, echoing with rage and certainty. She reminded them of their suffering, the floggings, the rapes, the humiliation, and called upon them to give the Romans no quarter. To her followers, she was more than human. She was destiny itself. But destiny would be tested by steel. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. He positioned his forces along a narrow defile, a place where thick woods rose on either side and where his flanks would be protected. Behind him stretched open ground, leaving no path for retreat, but that was deliberate. His men would fight knowing there was no escape. More importantly, the narrow terrain would neutralize Boudica's overwhelming numbers. Her great host could not envelop him. Instead, they would be forced to smash headlong into the solid wall of Roman shields. The Romans prepared themselves for the storm. Suetonius moved through the ranks, speaking not as a distant general but as a soldier among soldiers. He reminded them that they were Rome, that the entire weight of the empire stood behind them. Around 10,000 legionaries tightened their grips on their pila and gladii, their shields locked together, forming the living machine that had conquered half the known world. On the other side of the field, Boudica prepared her people. Her chariot raced back and forth, her daughters beside her, living reminders of the crimes Rome had committed. She lifted her spear and her voice carried across the host. She told them they fought not just for freedom, but for survival, that if Rome triumphed, their lands, their gods, their children would vanish forever. She vowed that she would win or die, but never again submit. To the tribes, her words were fire. The atmosphere before the battle was electric, heavy with the knowledge that this was no longer a mere clash of arms, but a reckoning between two worlds: Roman discipline versus Celtic fury, empire versus freedom, vengeance versus survival. Every man and woman on that field understood that the outcome would decide the fate of Britain itself. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, the earth itself would shake under the weight of history. The morning mist clung to the battlefield, as if the gods themselves wished to veil what was about to unfold. On one side, Suetonius Paulinus and his 10,000 Roman legionaries stood silent, their shields gleaming, their pila gripped tight. On the other, a vast ocean of humanity surged Boudica's host, perhaps 200,000 strong, filling the horizon with painted faces, war cries, and the thunder of chariots. Never before had Britain witnessed a confrontation of such scale. The rebels advanced with fury. At the front rolled Boudica's chariots, their iron scythes flashing, pulled by horses that snorted steam in the morning air. Behind them surged warriors of every tribe, men with spears and axes, women with daggers, even children hurling stones. They roared Boudica's name as if it were a battle hymn, their voices shaking the trees that flanked the Roman position. But the Romans did not move. They did not scream, did not roar, did not tremble. They waited. Suetonius had drilled them for this moment. Patience was their weapon. Then the order came. Like a single machine, the front ranks hurled their pila-heavy Roman javelins, designed not just to pierce, but to bend, rendering enemy shields useless. Thousands of spears arced through the air and slammed into the charging Celts. Shields splintered, bodies fell, momentum faltered. Before the tribes could recover, the second volley came, then the third. The front of the rebel army collapsed in chaos. And then the Romans advanced. Gladii short, stabbing swords flashed in the sun as the legions moved forward in tight formation. The testudo, the tortoise formation of interlocked shields, rolled forward like an iron wall. Celtic warriors hurled themselves against it, screaming, hacking, clawing, but discipline won over desperation. The Gladii struck again and again, precise thrusts into exposed bellies, throats, and faces. Every Roman strike found its mark. The narrow defile Suetonius had chosen became a trap. The vast numbers of the Celts became a curse. Those at the front were crushed between the Romans' relentless advance and the press of their own comrades behind them. Men stumbled over bodies, fell, and were trampled underfoot. Their war cries turned into screams of terror as they realized the terrible truth numbers meant nothing if they could not fight. Still, Boudica's host fought with ferocity. Chariots crashed into Roman lines, horses shrieking, drivers slashing. Women warriors screamed curses, hurling spears with deadly accuracy. For a moment, parts of the Roman line buckled. But the discipline held. Each legionary trusted the man beside him, each movement drilled to perfection. Step by bloody step, the machine advanced. When the Romans had cut deep enough into the mess, Suetonius unleashed his cavalry. With a thunder of hooves, Roman horsemen swept around the flanks, driving into the rebels like a scythe through wheat. Panic erupted. Trapped between the advancing legions, the cavalry, and their own wagons which the rebels had lined behind the battlefield to block retreat, the host of Boudica became a slaughterhouse. Ancient historians describe the carnage in chilling detail. Men, women, and even children were cut down without mercy. Chariots overturned, their drivers crushed. Fires spread as wagons caught flame. The earth itself seemed to drink the blood of thousands. By the end of the day, perhaps 80,000 Britons lay dead, their corpses piled in heaps so high that Roman soldiers struggled to move among them. The legions lost barely 400 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in Roman history, and one of the most brutal. And yet, even in defeat, the image of Boudica remained unbroken. Ancient accounts disagree on her fate. Some say she drank poison, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains. Others claim she fell sick and died soon after. The truth has been lost to time, but what mattered was that she did not live to see herself captured. To her people, she had chosen death over submission, sealing her legend with her final act of defiance. The battlefield fell silent as night descended, broken only by the moans of the dying and the crackle of burning wagons. Rome had survived, but the cost had been unimaginable. Entire cities lay in ashes. Tens of thousands of lives had been lost. And Britain itself had been scarred forever. For the Romans, it was a triumph of discipline and strategy. For the Britons, it was a tragedy written in blood. And for Boudica, it was immortality. She had not destroyed Rome, but she had carved her name into history so deeply that 2 millennia later, we still speak it with awe. When the smoke cleared from that apocalyptic battlefield, the land of Britain was changed forever. The Roman legions stood victorious, their discipline unshaken, their empire preserved. But the ground beneath their boots was littered with tens of thousands of corpses, men, women, even children who had once screamed Boudica's name as a war cry. The rebellion was broken, but in truth, Rome's triumph came at a staggering cost. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, though victorious, now faced the colossal task of rebuilding. Cities lay in ruins, Londinium reduced to ash, Verulamium gutted, countless smaller settlements wiped from the earth. The province's economy was shattered. Fields had been abandoned, trade disrupted, and survivors scattered in terror. Even the legions, though bloodied less than their foes, were weary from months of brutal campaigning. Worse still, Rome's grip on Britain had been shaken. For years, the province had been held by fear of Rome's legions, fear of its governors, fear of the empire's wrath. But Boudica had exposed the cracks in that illusion. She had shown that even the most powerful empire on earth could be challenged, even humiliated. The fires of London still smoldered as proof. Suetonius, hardened and merciless, sought to stamp out those embers. His response was ruthless. Villages suspected of rebellion were punished harshly. Survivors of the Iceni and Trinovantes were enslaved or executed. Roman law was reimposed with an iron fist, harsher now than before, a punishment meant to deter any thought of resistance. Yet this very severity unsettled the Roman Senate back in the imperial capital. When reports of the rebellion reached Emperor Nero, it is said he briefly considered abandoning Britain altogether. The devastation was so complete, the cost so high, that the province seemed almost worthless. But Rome's pride could not bear retreat. Instead, Nero chose a different path. Suetonius, though victorious, was dismissed from his governorship. His brutality, Rome feared, risked sparking new revolts. In his place, a more conciliatory governor was sent, tasked not with punishment, but with rebuilding, soothing, and Romanizing the province once more. Thus began a quieter, subtler conquest. Roads were rebuilt. Towns were reconstructed in stone rather than wood, as if Rome wished to erase the memory of fire by making everything permanent. Trade resumed. Roman law was softened in appearance, if not in spirit. Temples rose, villas spread, and gradually the native tribes were drawn once again into the web of Roman culture. But if Rome sought to erase Boudica's rebellion, it failed. Her story did not vanish with her death. Instead, it spread among the tribes. She became not just a queen, but a legend, a symbol of resistance whispered around firesides for generations. Her fiery hair, her chariot racing across the battlefield, her daughters beside her, these images burned brighter in memory than the ashes of defeat. Even among the Romans themselves, her name lingered. Chroniclers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio recorded her story with a mixture of fear and fascination. To them, she was both a cautionary tale of what happened when Rome's arrogance pushed subjects too far, and a symbol of barbarian fury that nearly toppled civilization itself. She was, in their words, a woman possessed of greater intelligence than her sex usually displayed, a backhanded Roman compliment that nonetheless preserved her stature as a figure of awe. Time, however, is a strange thing. What had once been a bitter memory slowly transformed into something greater. Centuries later, when Rome itself crumbled and new kingdoms rose, Boudica was remembered not as a defeated rebel, but as a heroic figure. Medieval chroniclers turned her into a warrior queen of myth, almost larger than life. By the time of the Renaissance and beyond, she was being reimagined as a national heroine, a defender of Britain against foreign oppression. The irony was stark. Rome had tried to erase her, but in doing so had immortalized her. The blood-soaked fields where her army fell became the soil from which her legend grew. She had lost the war, but won eternity. Even today, if you walk through London, you can see her statue, Boudica, in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, her spear raised high standing not far from the Houses of Parliament, a permanent reminder that once, in the heart of Britain, a queen rose in fire and nearly cast Rome into ruin. Her shadow still lingers, stretching far beyond that battlefield, far beyond Rome itself. And it whispers a truth that empires have always feared. Even the mightiest conquerors cannot kill a story. History, when left to the passage of time, often reshapes its figures. For some, memory fades into silence. But for others, like Boudica, the echo only grows louder, changing tone with every age that retells it. What began as a desperate rebellion against Rome became, over centuries, a story of defiance, freedom, and national identity. For the Britons of her own era, Boudica was remembered with grief and pride. The tribes whispered her name as they told tales of the woman who had risen when men faltered, the mother who had carried vengeance not only for her daughters, but for her entire people. Around firesides, long after Rome rebuilt its cities in stone, her figure lived on in song and memory, defeated in body, undefeated in spirit. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed and its legions abandoned Britain, the memory of Boudica found new soil. The Saxons and Normans who came after often wove her story into their chronicles, sometimes twisting it, sometimes admiring it. Medieval writers, fascinated by tales of warrior queens, cast her in a mythical light. They called her not merely Boudica, but sometimes Boadicea or Boadicea, blending fact with legend. She was painted less as a tribal leader and more as a near-mythic figure, a British Amazon who dared to defy the mightiest power the world had known. But her true rebirth came much later, in an age when England sought heroes to embody its identity. During the Renaissance, when classical texts were rediscovered, the writings of Tacitus and Dio reintroduced Boudica to the educated elite. To a country emerging from medieval turmoil, she became an example of native strength. A woman who had resisted foreign invaders. How could that not resonate with a people who prided themselves on independence? By the Victorian era, her legend soared higher still. Britain, now an empire itself, ruling lands far beyond Rome's reach, looked back at Boudica with a strange mixture of pride and irony. Here was a queen who had fought imperial oppression, now celebrated by an empire that itself ruled millions. The Victorians recast her not as a rebel against empire, but as a symbol of Britain's eternal spirit. Statues were raised, poems written, and her name engraved into the national imagination. The most famous tribute stands today near Westminster Bridge in London. Boudica, in her war chariot, her spear raised, her daughters at her side, defying Rome forever in bronze. The Victorians saw in her what they wanted to see: a noble queen, a mother defending her children, a patriot before patriotism existed. They overlooked the darker truths, the slaughter, the fires, the brutal vengeance she unleashed. Legends are rarely concerned with nuance. They are mirrors reflecting the needs of the age that tells them. And yet, that is the power of Boudica's story. She is not fixed in one moment. She shifts, evolves, adapts. To some, she was a blood-soaked barbarian who nearly destroyed a province. To others, she was a saintly mother, a national heroine, a feminist icon before her time. In truth, she was all of these things, and none of them. She was human flawed, fierce, consumed by fury, yet undeniably extraordinary. What endures most is the symbol, the vision of a woman standing against the unstoppable, wielding not just sword and spear, but the fire of defiance itself. That symbol has been powerful enough to cross 2,000 years, to outlive Rome itself, to inspire writers, poets, artists, and even politicians who invoke her name when they need to stir courage in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, Boudica did not destroy Rome. She could not. But Rome is dust now, its emperors forgotten, its legions long gone. And Boudica? Her statue still stands in London. Her story is still told in classrooms, in documentaries, in whispers of national pride. She lost the battle, but she won the story, and that is a victory empires can never erase. Boudica's story does not end on the battlefield, nor with the ashes of Londinium or Verulamium. History would have us mark her death as a conclusion, but the truth is far darker, far richer. Her rebellion echoes through time, a warning to empires and a beacon to the oppressed. It is a story of fury harnessed, of power defied, and of vengeance that transcends mere mortality. Consider the iron logic of her uprising. Rome, the mightiest empire the world had ever known, thought itself untouchable. Its legions marched with the certainty of absolute order. Its governors wielded authority as though sanctioned by the gods themselves. And yet, all that certainty was shattered by a queen whose fury, strategy, and courage could match, and at times surpass, even Rome's legendary discipline. Boudica was not simply a tribal leader. She was an equal to the greatest commanders of her time, a force of nature that no formula of empire could contain. Her vengeance was personal, but it was also universal. The brutal treatment she and her daughters suffered ignited the fires of rebellion, and those fires consumed everything in their path. Empires often dismiss grievances as trivial, believing that wealth, discipline, or intimidation can suppress outrage. Boudica proved them wrong. The destruction she wrought was not senseless. It was a measured, terrifyingly precise retaliation, a statement to the world that no humiliation is ever forgotten and no power is absolute. And yet, Boudica's story is also a meditation on the fragility of victory. Despite her genius, her courage, and her ferocity, she could not ultimately defeat Rome. Her army, no matter how vast, was still mortal. Her cities fell, her warriors perished, and she herself vanished, leaving only legend behind. The triumph of empire prevailed in the short term, yet it could not erase the memory of her defiance. This duality, the impossibility of erasing true courage, is what renders her story eternal. Think of the image of her standing in her chariot, spear raised, hair wild as flames, her daughters beside her, facing the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. That image is more than a historical moment, it is a metaphor for resistance, for the idea that a single individual, armed with resolve, intellect, and moral fury, can stand against overwhelming power and leave the world forever altered. Even in death, even in defeat, Boudica's shadow stretches long across history. Her legacy is not only cultural, but psychological. The very concept of empire, of absolute authority, is haunted by stories like hers. Leaders who presume that fear alone can control populations are reminded that injustice begets fury, that oppression carries within it the seeds of rebellion. Every empire that has risen, only to be challenged by a figure of singular courage, echoes Boudica's name in spirit. She is the eternal rebel, the one who whispers to those who suffer that even the mighty can bleed. In the quiet moments, centuries after the fires cooled, one can almost hear her voice carried on the wind through the streets of London, a warning and a promise. To the oppressors, it is a threat. No power lasts forever. To the oppressed, it is a beacon. Courage, fury, and conviction can shape history. She reminds us that legacies are not written solely by the victors, but by those who refuse to be silenced. And so, Boudica lives, not in the fleeting triumphs of battle, not in the ashes of cities, but in memory itself, a force that no empire, no matter how absolute, can extinguish. She is fury and strategy, vengeance and honor, death and immortality all intertwined. The fire she lit over 2 millennia ago still burns, not in smoke, but in the human heart, a reminder that courage defies time, and that some names, once spoken, can never be erased. Boudica's story is complete, and yet it will never end.